He asked one question: "How long did you train?" The American answered, 9 weeks. The German officer laughed. To the German military mind, this was a joke. A professional soldier, a Lanzer, was the product of years of brutal, repetitive drill. Their training manuals, some dating back to the Prussian era, detailed every conceivable action on the battlefield. Think of it as a perfectly choreographed, deadly ballet. Every step learned over years. But what happens when the enemy doesn't know the steps? This was the puzzle that confounded the Wehrmacht from Normandy to the Rhine. You see, the Americans were not professional army in the same way. They were an industrial one. The U.S. Army swelled from under 200,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million by 1945. There was simply no time for years of training. So they did something different. They didn't teach the men what to think. They taught them how to think. Fast. The Germans studied American training exercises, like the massive Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, and dismissed them as amateurish. Child's play. They saw trucks with "tank" painted on the side and laughed. A mistake that would cost them dearly. Here's the part nobody talks about. The fundamental difference wasn't in the tanks or the planes. It was in the sergeants. A German squad leader was trained to execute a plan flawlessly. If his officer was killed, he was taught to hold his ground and await new orders. But the American sergeant? He was expected to make a new plan, on the spot, with bullets flying. This was a direct reflection of two societies, one built on rigid hierarchy, the other on a culture of individual initiative. German intelligence reports from the front are filled with baffled observations. They describe American units, cut off and leaderless, that didn't surrender. Instead, they would form new, ad hoc groups and simply keep fighting. Imagine writing that report back to Berlin. The enemy is unprofessional, they do not follow doctrine, and we cannot stop them. The high command in Berlin saw the Americans as a mob, lucky amateurs who would break under pressure. They never suspected that this chaos was actually a system. A new doctrine developed in secret, designed for exactly this kind of war. A system so simple it could be taught in weeks, and so effective it would break the back of the most disciplined army in the world. So what was this American secret? It wasn't a new weapon or a faster tank. It was something a soldier could hold in his hand. It was a small, unassuming booklet. You might even call it a pamphlet. It was titled simply, Infantry Drill Regulations. This wasn't some ancient tome. It was a living document. The Germans, with their centuries of military tradition, had no equivalent. Their manuals were encyclopedic volumes. They dictated every move, every formation, every contingency. But this American manual? It was different. It wasn't about rigid adherence. It was about principles, not rules. Think about what that means for a moment. This small book, often carried in a uniform pocket, became the bedrock of a new kind of warfare. It distilled complex tactics into simple, adaptable frameworks. It empowered the individual. Here's the part nobody talks about. The Prussian military philosophy, refined over generations, emphasized absolute obedience and meticulous planning. From Frederick the Great's tactical innovations in the 18th century to the Schlieffen Plan of 1914, the German way was about precision. Every soldier was a cog, a vital, perfectly machined cog in a larger, intricate machine. This system produced incredible discipline. It produced soldiers who would march into a hail of bullets without breaking formation. You have to admire that kind of dedication. But it also created a vulnerability. What happens when the machine breaks? What happens when the cogs are scattered? The American approach, born from a different cultural soil, fostered something else entirely. It fostered initiative. They designed their training not to make perfect cogs, but to make adaptable individuals. The infantry drill regulations didn't prescribe solutions. It offered tools. It taught a soldier how to assess a situation, how to communicate, how to improvise. Consider the German Auftragstaktik, or mission command. It allowed junior officers some leeway in how they achieved their objectives, but the objective itself was fixed, often handed down from above. The American method went further. It encouraged sergeants, even privates, to identify new objectives if the original mission became impossible. They were told, "Take the hill." If the hill was suddenly impassable, they were expected to find another hill, or a bypass. This was a direct challenge to the German ideal of centralized control. It was chaotic, yes, but it was also incredibly resilient. German intelligence reports from the Eastern Front, where they faced the similarly adaptable Soviet forces, often noted a bewildering lack of proper command structure. They saw units operating independently, without direct orders. They often mistook this for disorganization. They failed to grasp that this was the organization. It was a fluid, decentralized network. The American training doctrine mirrored this. They didn't just teach marksmanship, they taught leadership to every man. Even the newest recruit was given scenarios where he had to make quick decisions, under simulated fire. This wasn't about following orders, it was about giving them. You might wonder how a 9-week training program could instill such capabilities. It seems impossible. But the American system was built on repetition of principles, not rote memorization of actions. They used live-fire exercises extensively, not just for shooting practice, for decision-making under pressure. They created a culture where failure to adapt was the only true failure. What did this look like on the battlefield? Imagine a German squad. Their officer falls. The non-commissioned officer, trained to hold the line, awaits new orders. Time passes. The situation deteriorates. Now, picture an American squad. Their lieutenant goes down. A sergeant or even a corporal immediately steps forward. He assesses, he communicates, he adapts. He doesn't wait for permission, he acts. This fundamental difference in philosophy between rigid perfection and agile adaptation would play out across thousands of battlefields. It would redefine what it meant to be a soldier. And it would leave the German High Command forever baffled by an enemy who seemed to invent new rules of engagement every single day. What was the true cost of this Prussian ideal of perfection? It was measured in the shattered remnants of their once invincible war machine. It was paid in the bewildered faces of officers who could not comprehend why their meticulously planned offensives collapsed against an enemy that refused to follow the script. This wasn't just a philosophical debate about military doctrine. This was a matter of life and death, on a scale never before seen. The German High Command, steeped in centuries of tradition, simply could not process what they were witnessing. They saw American units, often hastily assembled, performing feats of tactical improvisation that defied their every expectation. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine your entire world view, your professional training, your very identity being systematically dismantled by an enemy you dismissed as amateur. It's a bitter pill to swallow. German intelligence reports from the Western Front, declassified in 2003, contain repeated references to the unorthodox and unpredictable nature of American tactics. They struggled to categorize it. They had no framework. These reports often described small groups of American soldiers, cut off from their main units, still fighting aggressively, not just defending, but actively seeking out new engagements. This was not how a disciplined army behaved, according to their manuals. What do you think happened when a German squad was cut off? They waited for orders. They held their ground. And if those orders never came, they were often captured or overrun. The American doctrine, however, taught something entirely different. It taught them to become a new unit, a new fighting force, on the fly. This was not a flaw in their training. It was the very design. The U.S. Army's training program, particularly after the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, focused on small unit leadership. Not just for officers, but for every non-commissioned officer. Every corporal, every sergeant was drilled in decision-making. They were put into chaotic, simulated combat scenarios, sometimes for 72 hours straight with minimal sleep. These exercises weren't about memorizing a checklist. They were about a muscle memory for improvisation. General George S. Patton, a key figure in this training philosophy, famously said, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." This wasn't just a catchy quote. It was the guiding principle. You might think this sounds chaotic, and in many ways it was. But it was a controlled chaos, a system designed to thrive in the unpredictable environment of modern warfare. The Germans, with their emphasis on central command and rigid adherence to plans, found themselves constantly reacting. They were always one step behind. Even when their initial plans succeeded, the American ability to adapt quickly often negated their gains. This was particularly evident in the hedgerow country of Normandy. The Germans had prepared elaborate defensive positions. They expected a frontal assault, a methodical advance. What they got instead was a series of relentless, small unit attacks, often bypassing their strong points, exploiting unexpected weaknesses. It was like fighting a swarm. Every time they swatted one down, another appeared from a different direction. This is a crucial point that many historians overlook. The American training wasn't about making super soldiers. It was about making adaptable soldiers. It wasn't about individual heroism, though there was plenty of that. It was about collective resilience. The German focus on individual perfection, on the Lanzer as the ultimate fighting machine, ironically made them brittle. Break the machine and the cogs became useless. But with the Americans, each cog was also a mini-machine unto itself, capable of independent function. This is why the German High Command was so baffled. Their own system, for all its undeniable strengths, had a fatal weakness. It couldn't handle true decentralization. It couldn't cope with an enemy that didn't just break the rules, but seemed to invent them as they went along. And here's the quiet irony that escapes many. The American solution, born of necessity and a short training window, ultimately proved superior to a military tradition refined over centuries. It was not a question of bravery or dedication. It was a question of design. The Germans had built a perfectly engineered clock. The Americans had built a self-repairing organism. And in the brutal crucible of World War II, only one could survive. What would happen when this organism, this adaptable force, faced the ultimate test? The German heartland itself. This adaptable American force was not a distant battlefield. It was the German homeland itself, a landscape that would claim millions more lives. But before that, they had to survive a landscape unlike any they had ever encountered, a place where every field, every lane, became a death trap. This was the hedgerow country of Normandy. You see, the Germans had spent years perfecting their defenses. They built concrete bunkers. They laid minefields. They dug trenches. All standard military doctrine. But the hedgerows, these ancient earthen walls topped with dense thorn bushes, were different. They were a natural defense, centuries old, and they turned every square meter of the French countryside into a fortified position. German intelligence reports, declassified in 2008, show how thoroughly they understood this terrain. They integrated the hedgerows into their defensive lines, creating interlocking fields of fire. For the Americans, this was a nightmare. Their tanks, designed for open warfare, were useless. Every hedgerow became an impenetrable barrier, every crossing point a killing zone. Imagine trying to advance through a maze where every wall hides a machine gun, every step a potential ambush. This was not the war they trained for. This was something new. A brutal, grinding fight, inch by bloody inch. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, later described it as the most difficult fighting of the war. His frustration was palpable. The American advance stalled. Casualties mounted. The adaptable force, for the first time, seemed to falter. What do you think happened when an American infantry squad faced a hedgerow? They tried to blast through it. They tried to climb over it. Both methods were devastatingly costly. The Germans, hidden just meters away, would wait, then unleash a torrent of fire. This was the moment where the training, the emphasis on individual initiative, truly paid off. Not in grand strategy, but in desperate, moment-to-moment survival. One soldier, Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, saw the problem firsthand. His unit was pinned down, unable to advance. He observed the futility of conventional attacks. He saw his friends die, and he thought, there has to be another way. This wasn't a general. This wasn't a staff officer. This was a sergeant, in the mud, under fire. He took a piece of German steel, cut from a wrecked tank, and welded it to the front of an American M4 Sherman tank. He shaped it like a giant set of teeth, a hedgerow cutter. The idea was simple. The execution was brilliant. The Rhino tank was born. This wasn't in any manual. This wasn't ordered from above. This was pure battlefield improvisation. A solution born of necessity by a man who refused to accept defeat. The official reports rarely highlight these individual moments of genius. They focus on numbers, on objectives taken. But it was men like Cullen who actually changed the tide. Within days, hundreds of these devices were fabricated in makeshift workshops. Every Sherman tank became a Rhino. The hedgerows, once impenetrable, were now breached. The German defenses, so meticulously planned, were suddenly outflanked. The Germans were baffled. Their intelligence reports, previously confident, became increasingly desperate. They couldn't understand how the Americans were suddenly tearing through their lines. They had no countermeasure. This was the ultimate expression of the American training philosophy. Empower the individual, trust their judgment, and let them find a way. It was messy. It was chaotic. But it won. The cost, however, was immense. The hedgerow fighting claimed tens of thousands of lives. The sheer brutality of it left scars that would never heal. Think of the psychological toll on those who fought through that maze of death. But it also forged something unbreakable, a resolve that would carry them across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. What kind of men emerged from that crucible, and what did they carry with them long after the war ended? Than their rifles. They carried the memory of what it took to survive. But they also carried a new way of seeing the world. A mindset forged in fire. A belief that any problem, no matter how impenetrable, could be solved with ingenuity and a little bit of scrap metal. This wasn't just a military doctrine anymore. It had become a part of them. When over 8 million men returned home, they didn't simply slot back into their old lives. They brought the war's most important lesson with them: adapt or die. And now, think about what that means for a society. Millions of young men, trained to question authority, to improvise under pressure, and to take initiative. You've just injected a massive dose of disruptive energy into the system. The United States government did something unprecedented with the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. You know it as the GI Bill. It's often remembered as a reward, a thank you, but it was something more. It was an investment in this new mindset. By 1947, veterans accounted for 49% of all college admissions in America. These weren't traditional students. They were men who had seen the world fall apart and had helped put it back together. They challenged their professors. They demanded practical applications. They had no patience for theories that didn't work in the real world. The German model of perfection and precision rebuilt a shattered nation into an economic titan. A testament to order. The American solution, chaotic and individualistic, fueled something different. An explosion of entrepreneurship, a boom in new technologies. The suburbs that sprang up across the country weren't just houses. They were experiments in a new way of living, built by men who were used to creating something from nothing. The official histories focus on the generals and the politicians. But nobody talks about the sergeants who came home and started their own businesses. The corporals who used their GI Bill loans to invent new tools. The privates who saw a problem in their community and, instead of waiting for orders, simply organized a solution. This was the quiet legacy of those 9-week recruits. The German officer who laughed in 1944 would never understand. He saw unprofessionalism. He failed to see the seeds of a new kind of world, one where the ability to adapt was more valuable than the ability to obey. And this brings us to a final, unsettling thought. We built a nation on the bedrock of improvisation. We celebrated the rule breakers, the innovators, the Sergeant Cullens who saw a better way and just did it. But that system was forged in a total war for survival. What happens to that spirit in a time of peace and prosperity? When the algorithms predict every outcome and procedures govern every action, have we built a world that is too perfect? A world with no room for the rhino